Welcome to the Open Learning Campus, brought to you by the World Bank Group.
This video focuses on the means or climate policy instruments that can help achieve climate mitigation goals. Climate policy typically includes regulatory and market-based instruments. Regulatory instruments, like standards, directly control the activities of firms and individuals. Market-based instruments, like carbon taxes and emissions trading schemes, encourage behavior through market signals. Let's start the conversation about regulations and standards. Countries are increasingly using performance and technology standards for buildings and vehicles in order to enhance efficiency and mitigate climate change. Let's hear some recent experiences in India.
In India, the vast amount of building infrastructure is yet to be built. There are estimates that approximately 70% of the buildings that will exist in 2030 have not yet been built. It makes it important that we influence the design of these future buildings so that each one is more efficient than the last. It was with this in mind that the Energy Conservation Building Code was created. The idea that there should be an Energy Conservation Building Code, and particularly for commercial buildings, is enshrined in the Energy Conservation Act. Benefit that the Building Code provides is that developers now make buildings that meet a particular minimum criterion of energy efficiency as set out by the code. And therefore, when you or I, as a buyer or as a tenant, go into a code-compliant building, we are very sure that the energy bills that we will get would be dramatically lower. This is a very clear economic benefit for the buyer or tenant, and it's also a very clear message to the developer that he can invest in a more energy efficient building, knowing that he will get returns that are commensurate with it. The transportation sector accounts for about a third of the total petroleum consumption in the country. And this is an area where the total amount of petroleum that is used is growing dramatically. It becomes important, therefore, to ensure that while the mobility needs of people are met, they are met in a manner that the energy required to meet that mobility is minimized. Two policy problems. One is of driving more, and that is addressed through rationalization of petroleum prices and ensuring that they meet marginal costs. So that's something that's happening. The second is upweighting. As each one of us buys larger and larger cars, we need to make sure that the energy consumption does not grow out of hand. And that became the central defining imperative for the need to have fuel efficiency standards for cars in India.
Having reviewed these examples of regulatory instruments, let's talk about market-based approaches. If properly designed and implemented, market-based instruments allow achieving climate mitigation goals at the lowest overall cost to the society. Market-based instruments are increasingly being used by governments in developed and developing countries in the form of carbon pricing policies.
Climate change is arguably the world's greatest market externality, which is to say that the emission of carbon pollution and other climate-changing pollution doesn't have a market price on it. If you want your markets to function properly, you need to, in some way, establish a market price for carbon, either explicitly or implicitly.
Governments can establish a price on carbon through carbon taxation or emissions trading schemes. The European Union established the world's biggest emission trading scheme 10 years ago.
Well, the carbon market in Europe covers half of the emissions. In fact, the emissions from all major industrial installations. And so the power sector, the steel, the chemicals, the cement factories, etc., they are all covered by the carbon market. But there are lots of other things we are doing outside the carbon market. We are regulating cars and vans, and we are regulating fluorinated gases, the construction of renewable energy, etc. But that is not done through the carbon market. The carbon market covers the major industrial installations, and under 2030, we decided to upgrade our target from 20% to 40%. So that means that the emissions reductions delivered through the carbon market will have to increase with 20%. The environmental benefits are relatively clear because under a carbon market, you have to define a cap. And a cap is the total amount of pollution that is allowed inside the system. And so the cap is going down, and year by year, the total cap is going down with 1.7%. Under the 2030 framework, we are going to review that from 1.7 up to 2.2% annual reduction of the cap. And the system takes care of itself because the cap determines the supply of allowances. And so there is going to be a demand and supply, and demand is delivering a price. So the environmental outcome is always guaranteed under a carbon market system, and that, I think, is the attraction of the system. And the economic benefit is that through a carbon market, who is reducing his or her emissions? It is the one who can do it at the lowest cost. That's the logic of a market. So, in fact, on a carbon market, what you are doing, you are inviting the one with the cheapest options to reduce emissions to do it. And so that's why in Europe, in fact, we reduced our emissions on the carbon market at a much lower price compared to what we anticipated. Perhaps the most important lesson is that there should be trust on a market, because on a market you exchange allowances. You have to be sure that what you pay for has a value. So the question is how to build trust. And one of the elements that is very critical is that you have an excellent system of monitoring and reporting and verifying of emissions in the private sector. Because if cheating occurs, people are going to turn away from the market and there is going to be a lack of trust.
Mexico recently implemented a carbon tax in the form of an explicit price on carbon, which is directly linked to the carbon content in fossil fuels.
Instead of having a carbon tax related or attached to the emissions in the stack of an industry, we have a carbon tax according with the carbon content of each fuel. For example, natural gas has just one atom of carbon, and there are other heavy fuels like coal that has more than 200 atoms of carbon. So we are expecting to have a clear signal of what are the fuels with lower environmental impact, and the people will choose according with the environmental criteria of this tax. The carbon tax will be paid by reductions, credits that can obtain if the companies present a reduction plan or present a reduction evidence of greenhouse gas emissions. The benefits that we are expecting is the switch fueling from very heavy fuels to light fuels. So that will produce a reduction of the emissions, especially from the industry sector. At the beginning of the discussions of this carbon tax, the industry complains a little bit because, well, they thought that it will be a very aggressive carbon tax, but not. We took the carbon price at the moment in the international market. It was more or less $6 per ton, and Congress decided to establish a 50% fee in this carbon tax. They also established the mechanism to avoid the carbon tax if you have already credits in the market.
Climate policy instruments can also be implemented at subnational levels. British Columbia, a province of Canada, has led subnational efforts in carbon pricing.
So the tax was implemented in 2008, announced a budget in February, and it came as quite a surprise to many people. The main elements of the tax at the time included a basic sort of tax on carbon, starting at $10 and ramping up over a 4-year period to $30 at $5 increments. And then it included, quite importantly, a revenue recycling component. And the revenue recycling component did a number of things. First, it demonstrated sort of revenue neutrality. So it said to the electorate, this is not a tax grab. We're going to collect tax receipts, carbon tax receipts from you, but we're going to also reduce your income tax, both personal and corporate, and we're going to also give you some payments or lump sum payments to help ease the burden of the impact on your energy prices. And this went a long way to sort of allaying fears that the carbon tax was going to hit those most vulnerable in society, the low-income houses, and also would hurt the competitiveness position of industry. The tax rate was applied and is now collecting about $1 billion annually, and at the same time, income taxes were reduced significantly. So corporate income taxes, for example, dropped from 12% to 10%, and then low-income taxes dropped from below 8% down to about 7%, so quite large shifts in taxes. And then to sort of address the regressive concern, meaning the impact on low-income houses, sort of people with a large share of their energy budget as a share of their total household budget, to allay fears that they would be disproportionately impacted, they were given and continue to be given all kinds of sort of lump sum payments, which are basically, checks, sort of credits, tax credits and this sort of thing that help reduce the impact on the households. The Minister of Environment in British Columbia basically said the tax is simple, it's well understood, and it's accepted. The biggest lesson, I think, to roll out from the carbon tax is that, carbon policy does not wreck the economy.
So, what are the differences between a carbon tax and an emissions trading scheme?
A trading scheme guarantees the quantity of pollution and hence is quite attractive often to green groups, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee the price, and the returns from carbon trading can fluctuate over time, and you'd expect them to do that. Carbon taxes are simpler than trading schemes. Trading schemes require a lot more market infrastructure to be put in place. But on the other hand, trading schemes can unleash more entrepreneurial opportunities as well, because there's greater scope for profit under a trading scheme.
In this video, we have learned examples of a menu of policy instruments that aim for a low emissions development path. In practice, a climate policy package includes a complementary set of policy instruments. Ultimately, policy choices depend on nationally specific circumstances. Thank you.